Yes, the Americans put the first man on the moon, and the second, and all the other 10. Neil Armstrong stepped there on July 21st, 1969, and became the most famous astronaut of them all. This was such a huge accomplishment that most people say it trumps everything else ever done by anyone else in space. And when you think of the effort involved, it's probably true. But there was a time before July 21st, 1969, when the space race was still very much on and had been on for 2 decades. And in that race, the Soviets arrived first to the moon, although not with a cosmonaut. This is the story of the first man-made object to arrive at the moon, sent there by the Soviets. The first flyby flight to the moon, launched by the Soviets. The first soft landing on the moon, done by the Soviets. The first ship to orbit the moon, again by the Soviets. The first rover on the moon, made by, you guessed it, the Soviets. And the first return mission from the moon, and yes, it was the Soviets. I am Alex Deva, and you're listening to The Soviet Space Saga. Sputnik hadn't even been approved by the time Korolev began to talk about a moon launch. At the time, it was only a discussion, but a few years later, he proposed it in a formal paper. Reaching the moon had always been one of his dearest dreams, and although the spaceships that were built for that purpose had the official name Luna, he called them Mechta, which means dream. The word Luna means, of course, moon, which is not quite as creative. But the dream started as a nightmare, as the first 3 Lunas never even made it to the Earth orbit from where they were supposed to start their 400,000 kilometers trip. In 1958, the Americans were waking up and recovering in the space race. They had launched their first satellite in January of that year, and were also looking at the moon with anticipation. The first moon probe that the United States planned to launch was called Pioneer, and it was scheduled for August 17, 1958. The date is important because Korolev and his team worked around the clock for months to be able to launch in the very same day. But because the Soviet R-7 rocket was so much more powerful than anything the Americans had, the Soviets had one luxury. They could arrive at the moon faster, using a shorter trajectory than the one chosen by NASA, which at that time was all of 3 weeks old. The space race was now at its closest. Competing launches were happening not at months' distance, but at days and sometimes hours. Both governments and both peoples took it terribly seriously by now, and the whole rest of the world was watching. Korolev's plan was to wait and see if Pioneer would launch successfully. If yes, then he would also launch, and all things going well, he could still beat the United States to the moon. As it happened, the wait took all of 77 seconds, after which Pioneer exploded, and the Soviet rocket was, wisely, carried back for more work. It took another month before the rocket was finally deemed ready, with a brand new third stage that worried Korolev a lot. The liftoff took place on September 23rd, and the third stage didn't fail. It didn't have an opportunity to fail either, because the boosters exploded after 1.5 minutes. It wasn't going much better for the Americans either. They scheduled the second Pioneer launch for October, not knowing anything about the Soviet failures, which were, as always, carefully hidden. Korolev again enacted his plan to wait until the Americans launched, see if it went well, and if yes, launch his own mission, which would be faster. But Pioneer failed again, and it was once more the turn of the Soviets. They launched again on October 12th, and it went only slightly better. This time the rocket held for 11 seconds longer before it exploded. Had the American and the Soviet missions been successful, the Soviet probe would have overtaken Pioneer and won by as little as 6 hours. That was how tight the space race had become at that point. After gathering up the debris from the explosions and looking at everything carefully, Korolev's team found a surprising fact. That new third stage, even though it hadn't even had a chance to fire, was in fact the cause of the problems. Its shape and mass created vibrations in the rocket that the boosters could not manage. They quickly scrambled to invent and create vibration dampeners, then to mount them on a brand new R-7 rocket, which had been built in a record 2 months. This one took off at the beginning of December, and it went past the dangerous phase, giving everyone high hopes that 3 was the lucky number. After all, even though the R-7 didn't have a perfect record, it would have been highly unusual for 3 consecutive launches to fail. 4 minutes into the launch, a simple seal broke, exposing a pump to vacuum, which damaged the gearbox of the pump, which effectively killed the engine. Korolev was mad. Back in the United States, things weren't much better. Pioneer 3 flew over 100,000 kilometers, but a bad sensor caused its engine to stop early, less than 4 seconds too soon. And that was enough for the rocket to fall back to Earth and burn up over Africa. Because unsuccessful launches were erased in the Soviet Union and nobody was allowed to talk about them in public, Luna 1 was in fact the 4th launch, and it wasn't entirely successful either. It missed the moon by 6,000 kilometers, thus becoming the first man-made object to enter an orbit around the Sun. In the beginning, the Soviets called it First Cosmic Ship, and then said, well, yeah, sure, that's exactly what we wanted to do all along, and stuck with that lie for about 3 decades. Much later, though, they finally allowed it to keep the name Luna 1, only making things more confusing. But it wasn't all in vain, though, since one of the things that Luna 1 managed to do was to determine that the moon doesn't have a magnetic field. What was more, the Soviets could now boast with another first, the first actual cosmic trip. In the meantime, the Americans had their own chance of missing the moon, except their miss was 10 times larger at over 60,000 kilometers. It should also be mentioned that while the Soviet ship weighed over 150 kilograms, the Pioneers were tiny, weighing between 6 and 39 kilograms. The largest American probe was only a quarter of the Soviet one. Here, the Americans were ahead, if not in terms of mass lift capability, but in terms of miniaturization. Because they were forced to make things small and light, since they didn't have a big enough rocket, they were able to make huge advances in that direction. Besides missing the actual moon, Korolev's team made another totally perplexing mistake. They launched on a Friday night. So even though the Soviet press agency TASS had made quite sure to tell the world how and where they could see the ship, and to announce the radio frequencies where the ship could be heard, and even though the ship was broadcasting on 3 different frequencies just to be sure, only a handful of people heard it outside the Soviet Union, because most scientists were gone for the weekend. As a result, some people in the West thought it was all a big red lie, which even turned into the title of someone's book. In order to avoid a similar lack of attention, for their next moon mission, the Soviets actually sent a message to radar tracking astronomers, telling them exactly when and where to look. It actually took that direct message from Moscow to make the astronomer Bertrand Lovell give up his cricket match and come to Jodrell Bank Observatory. It was another weekend in September 1959, and the Soviets had launched an even bigger moon probe which weighed nearly 400 kilograms and which was initially known as, get ready, Second Cosmic Ship. The launch went flawlessly. The ship was dead center on its moon trajectory, and when it was about halfway, it released a cloud of sodium vapors, which was highly reflective of sunlight and quickly expanded to over 600 kilometers, making it visible by telescope. All the media outlets around the planet stood by to announce the moment of impact. It came right on time and exactly where it was planned, proving that the Soviets could hit a moving target in space from nearly 400,000 kilometers. The news of this huge Soviet success was delivered to the world by the cricketer astronomer Bertrand Lovell, who managed to convince the remaining Americans who still thought it was all a big red lie. When it crashed on the moon, the Soviet ship spread 72 stainless steel pennants, which on one side had the Soviet hammer and sickle, and on the other had the date of the launch. Khrushchev immediately gave a model of these to the American President Eisenhower as soon as he arrived in New York on board the magnificent Tupolev 114, a huge Soviet airliner with 2 decks that made the trip over the ocean without stopping to refuel. The first successful mission to the moon was heralded as a great scientific achievement, and the results were published in the next year. Among the things that scientists learned after going through all 14 kilometers of paper containing the observations sent by the ship was that the Van Allen radiation belt extends as far as 50,000 kilometers, that there was no radiation or magnetism coming from the moon, and that the moon might have an ionosphere. In the next months, the Soviets launched more moon probes which aimed to photograph the hidden side of the moon in detail and send the images back to Earth. The first human-made object to see the hidden side of the moon was Luna 3 in October 1959. And even though it all happened 400,000 kilometers away from the Cold War, it was still an opportunity for some good old-fashioned spy work. The Soviet probes, you see, didn't have television cameras like the American ones. Instead, they had mechanical, more or less normal film cameras. Such a film camera was on board the Luna probes, properly orientated, and made to shoot up to 40 pictures of the moon. Then the film was developed right inside the probe, and the negatives were scanned and sent by radio back to Earth as soon as the probe popped back from behind the moon. But the Soviets didn't have the capability to manufacture camera film that wouldn't be ruined by space radiation. So they used American film instead. But they didn't go and buy it. Instead, they stole some of the American spy balloons that were sometimes sent high above the Soviet Union and simply took the film in their cameras. The Americans certainly did their own spying. In 1960, riding the wave of their huge success with Luna 3, the Soviets organized an exhibition in Mexico City to boast with their space technology. But in a display of unbelievable carelessness, they sent to the exhibition an actual third stage of the R-7 rocket, not a mock-up, but the real thing. More than that, they had lax security, which allowed the CIA to hijack the car that was taking the rocket back to the train station and drive it into a special location chosen because it had really tall walls. There, they opened the crate, measured everything, took as many photographs as they possibly could, and even swabbed the interior for propellant remains. In order to do all that, they did have to break an official Soviet plastic seal, but a fast car took it to the local CIA station where a brand new fake seal was quickly created on the spot and sent back to the warehouse at speed. The agents sealed everything back, closed the crate, and let it back on its merry way back to Moscow. In the United States, things weren't going all that well with the moon missions, with no fewer than 7 failures of the Pioneer mission. One of the things you can do when you're losing a race is to declare that you're not actually in the race. And that's exactly what the NASA administrator did. He suggested to President Eisenhower to say, in his 1960 State of the Union speech, that, quote, "We are not going to attempt to compete with the Russians on a shot-by-shot basis in attempts to achieve space spectaculars." By now, the moon was becoming more and more attractive to a manned flight, and both the Soviets and the Americans had different theoretical solutions as to how that might be done. The next year, on May 25, 1961, President Kennedy announced before the Congress that he was engaging the United States on the biggest, most daring and most expensive space endeavor ever, to put a man on the moon and return him safely to Earth before the end of the decade.
I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth. No single space project in this period will be more impressive to mankind or more important for the long-range exploration of space, and none will be so difficult or expensive to accomplish.
The Soviets arrived at the same decision, but more than 3 years later. Korolev proposed to do it in 5 steps. First, to fly around the moon. Then, to send a lunar rover to find a suitable site for a manned landing. Step number 3, the actual manned landing. 4, more research and mapping from a lunar orbit. And finally 5, a manned lunar rover. In order to achieve that, the various Soviet technical bureaus had to compete with each other, so 3 proposals were made. One was by Korolev himself, who suggested the heavy-lift N1 booster on which his team had been working for 8 years. The other was by one of his rivals, Vladimir Chelomey, who proposed his own Proton rocket. And the third proposal was the R-56 rocket made by Mikhail Yangel's bureau. In what became one of the most important and probably bad decisions in the Soviet space saga, the communist leadership decided to give Chelomey the task of sending a man around the moon by 1967, and to Korolev the task to land a man on the moon by 1968. That meant that the Soviets had to deliver sooner than the Americans, despite already being 3 years behind. Giving the work to competing bureaus certainly did not help, since the Soviet Union had considerably fewer resources than the United States. Their respective plans were also competing with each other, and therefore much too optimistic. Rather than making a decision based on what was possible, they had decided based on what the Americans were doing. None of that helped. Efforts now were directed towards achieving the world's first soft landing on another celestial body. The soft landing is one that leaves the spacecraft functional, that is to say, not just to crash it into the moon. That meant that the spacecraft had to be able to brake, so an engine had to be added, and of course fuel for that engine. That made everything bigger and heavier, which in turn implied a more powerful rocket to launch it. There was a lot of work to be done. Luna 4 was an embarrassing miss, and Luna 5 did arrive at the moon, but crashed and exploded rather than landing softly. Luna 6 failed too when the engine performing a mid-course correction refused to shut down. Luna 7 was launched exactly 8 years after Sputnik, and it had a perfect travel all the way to the moon, but as it oriented itself for landing, it lost track of Earth because of a sensor that had been installed at the wrong angle. That made it incapable of firing the landing engine, so it crashed into the moon at a great speed, just like Luna 5. This array of failures didn't sit well with the communist leadership. Korolev's main sponsor, Khrushchev, had been replaced after a political conspiracy by Leonid Brezhnev. The new General Secretary summoned Korolev to Moscow to explain himself, and Korolev had to promise success next time. Luna 8 was a flawless mission all the way into descending on the moon, but when the time came for it to inflate the landing airbags, one of them got pierced by a sharp piece of metal, and the gas sent the probe spinning. Again unable to orientate itself, Luna 8 too crashed at high speed. Korolev was again summoned to Moscow to explain, but this time he didn't go. On January 13th, 1966, he went to the hospital and was operated on by the Minister of Health himself, Dr. Boris Petrovsky. During the surgery, strong bleeding occurred, which necessitated a new urgent intervention. For this new intervention, Korolev should have been intubated, but the medics were unable to open his jaws enough for the tube, because his jaws had been broken while he'd been tortured in his youth. Then the surgeons discovered a massive tumor. Then the anesthetic wasn't what it should have been, and beneath it all, Korolev had a very weak heart by that time. He was pronounced dead the next day. As I've said in the first episode, the history of the Soviet space program can be divided into before and after Korolev's death. Losing him changed everything. No one else emerged with the same management skills, the same leadership abilities, the same talent for design. Some historians even say that the Soviets would have put a cosmonaut on the moon, perhaps even before Armstrong, if Korolev had still been alive. His deputy, Vasily Mishin, became his replacement. A good pilot, a good engineer, a good inventor, and a kind man. Mishin was, however, ignorant in the socialist labyrinth that had to be navigated day by day in order to drive forward the space program. He was indecisive and sometimes gave the impression that he didn't want the job. But the job went on nonetheless. Only a few days after Korolev was buried in the Kremlin wall, Luna 9 became the first man-made vessel to perform a soft landing on another space body, the Moon. As soon as it started transmitting, it became a propaganda tool. Again, the United States were behind in the race. Their own project, Surveyor, was much more advanced than Luna, but sadly far from launch. Using a strange pinhole camera and some angling mirrors, it took Luna 100 minutes to get together a photograph of its surroundings, which it then proceeded to send back to Earth. Among the people listening were the astronomers of Jodrell Bank in Manchester. When the sounds were piped through the rooms of the observatory, the public relations officer happened to be inside, and amazingly he recognized the sounds. It was the sound of the radiofax system which he, working with newspapers, had gotten used to hearing every day. The Soviets appeared to use the established fax method to send back that historical photo. The astronomers quickly sent a car to Manchester to pick up the fax machine that the newspaper Daily Express were using, connected it to the radio, and watched in utter amazement as the photo simply came out on the paper. It was to be the first photo ever to come from the surface of the Moon. They could see boulders and pebbles, and a generally rocky surface, and the slope of a crater. Everything in the picture had long shadows, which had been intentional. The timing of the photograph process had been chosen when the shadows would be long in order to create contrast and references. Everyone with a television set in the Western world could see the photographs in a matter of minutes. The next day, they were on the front page of every newspaper. The Soviets were raging with fury because their photos had been, quote-unquote, stolen. It had been a great worry whether Luna 9 would land on firm ground or whether it would just be engulfed in a thick layer of dust. The debate was going on in both the United States and the Soviet Union. Obviously, in the event it was proven that the surface of the Moon was hard enough. But before the launch, discussions went on and on. After listening to all the arguments, Korolev simply said, "The surface of the Moon is solid." There were many important academics in the room, and one of them objected, saying that nobody could support such a statement. At that, Korolev took a page from his notebook, wrote on it, "The surface is solid," signed his name underneath, and gave it to the scientist. "Here, you have it signed," he said. Just imagine solving anything that way in the United States. Having deployed the first artificial satellite of Earth, and then, accidentally, the first artificial satellite of the Sun, The Soviets' next step was the first artificial satellite of the Moon. This was Luna 10, and it was launched in March 1966. It took 2 tries. On the first try, the upper stage failed and what was supposed to be a satellite of the Moon got stuck as a satellite of the Earth. The Soviets promptly renamed it to Cosmos 111 and said that they meant to do that. The second try took place later the same month, and after a perfect flight, it slowed down and became the first spacecraft to orbit the Moon. Once again, besides winning a new first in the space race, the Soviets went a bit farther. The mission took place at the same time as the 23rd Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, and as it emerged from behind the Moon, Luna 10 started broadcasting the notes of the Internationale, which was the anthem of the socialist movement. 5,000 participants at the Congress stood up and clapped enthusiastically, and it was only revealed 30 years later that the playback was actually of a recording, since the engineers didn't dare do a live broadcast. Luna missions 11 to 13 were all successful moon photography missions, and Luna 14 was a communications project. But there was something about Luna 15 which makes it highly relevant. You see, when Luna 15 arrived at the Moon, it found a celestial body that was no longer lifeless. The Moon, for the first time in billions of years, was now inhabited. There were 2 life forms on the Moon, which were at that very moment enjoying themselves about 300 kilometers from the Soviet probe. These 2 life forms had names. One was called Neil Armstrong and the other Buzz Aldrin. On July 20th, 1969, the Americans put the first human beings on the Moon as part of the Apollo program. This was a truly historic event, and it is usually marked as the day when the Soviets lost the space race, despite winning more or less every other milestone until then. The Soviets failed in their efforts after the N-1 rocket failed to launch in all 4 attempts. The unmanned probe Luna 15 arrived at the Moon and sadly crashed into a mountain, underlining the failure of the Soviet manned Moon program. The race to put a man on the Moon was won by the Americans, but the space race was still going on and the Soviets still managed to win some firsts. Their next lunar probe, Luna 16, was the first robotic sample return mission in the history of space exploration. However, it was only the 3rd sample return mission overall, since both Apollo 11 and Apollo 12 had brought back some moonstones by then. What made Luna 16 special was that it was robotic. 101 grams of lunar soil were sent back to the Soviet Union in a capsule that flew straight from the Moon to Kazakhstan. A true first was accomplished during the next mission, when Luna 17 landed on the Moon and deployed the first robotic rover there. It was called Lunokhod 1. It was solar-powered and it operated for 11 months, during which it traveled over 10 kilometers. 7 more lunar probes were launched until 1976. In total, the lunar program had 15 successful missions and, as you've heard, accomplished a number of firsts in space exploration. The Americans put the first men on the Moon, and it was an incredibly difficult feat, but they did it knowing more or less what to expect. But the Soviets put the first man in orbit with almost no idea what to expect. No human being had ever been to space, and there were uncountable questions about what might happen to the first one. Today we know the answers to those questions. We know that you don't go crazy in space and that your heart can still beat. But when the first man went to space, all of these things were unknowns. The Soviets estimated that the chances of success for such a mission would be less than 50%. And they did it anyway. Join me in the next episode to hear about Yuri Gagarin's adventure as the first human being to see the Earth from orbit. This has been an episode of The Soviet Space Saga, a podcast written and produced by me, Alex Deva. If you like the way I tell stories, look up my books on Amazon. If you have questions or comments about this podcast, just send me a message. My website is alxx.se, and you'll find a link to it in the episode description. Thank you so much for listening.